On 6 February 1981, Yoweri Museveni and 26 other rebels from his popular resistance army, including current Rwandan President Paul Kagame, launched an attack on the Kabamba military school in Uganda to get hold of some weapons. This attack marked the beginning of the brutal Ugandan civil war, and for the next 5 years, Yoweri Museveni's armed group, which later became known as the National Resistance Army, waged a guerrilla war against Milton Obote's regime in Uganda. The resistance eventually prevailed, and on 26 January 1986, Yoweri Museveni declared himself the president of Uganda, and he has been the leader of the nation ever since. This is the story of Yoweri Museveni's rise to power. Yoweri Museveni's origins are shrouded in mystery. There are many versions of where he was born and his true nationality. The official version is that Yoweri Museveni was born into a family of Hima cattle herders, a clan of the Ankole people of southwestern Uganda around 1944. Others claim that Yoweri Museveni was born in Rwanda despite his insistence that he was born in Uganda. The most informed sources who have known Museveni since his early childhood insist that he and his now late mother came to Uganda from Butare, southern Rwanda, when he was born around April 1943. At the age of 7, he was sent to school at Kiamate Primary, where he met Martin Wesiga and Eria Kategaya, who were to become two close colleagues in the adult political struggles that lay ahead. In 1962, while at Ntare Senior Secondary School in Mbarara, Museveni became a born-again Christian, but in 1966 he broke with established Christianity over the refusal by the missionaries at Ntare Senior Secondary School to allow the Scripture Union to debate his motion condemning Ian Smith's Universal Declaration of Independence in Rhodesia, now present-day Zimbabwe. For some time, Yoweri had been unhappy with some of the missionaries' biblical interpretations, and in particular, he believed that their stand of evading worldly issues and condemning all violence, even as a means of liberation, was immoral. By this time, Yoweri Museveni had also developed an interest in Ugandan politics. He and his student colleagues condemned the sectarian basis of much of Ugandan party politics. Many years later, Museveni would say that he adopted the idea of launching an armed resistance in 1966 while doing his A-levels at Ntare School in reaction to then Uganda's president Milton Obote's dictatorial practices in overthrowing the Ugandan constitution. In 1967, Yoweri Museveni went to the University of Dar es Salaam to study political science. He preferred Dar es Salaam to Uganda's own Makerere University simply because he perceived it to be politically more radical, and he saw Tanzania under Julius Nyerere as the one African country that provided clear support for the liberation movements of Southern Africa. But at the University of Dar es Salaam, he found most of the university's staff not being radical enough, and so Museveni founded the student discussion group, the University Students' African Revolutionary Front. It was around this time that he made contact with the Mozambican liberation movement, Frelimo, and he met Eduardo Mondlane, Samora Machel, and Joaquim Chissano. Frelimo's War of Liberation in Mozambique against the Portuguese colonial government gave Museveni his first exposure to guerrilla mobilization of rural villagers. Museveni would later state that the war liberated Mozambican peasants from their colonial mentality to become guerrilla officers, no longer regarding tribal identities and differences as being important. In September of 1968, Museveni led a small group of students to visit a liberated zone in northern Mozambique. The contacts and relationships he made during this time were to prove invaluable in the future when Museveni and his colleagues needed military training in guerrilla warfare. Upon graduating in 1970, Yoweri Museveni got employment in the president's office in Kampala as a research assistant, and he briefly joined Obote's UPC. Although professing to have distrusted Obote and the UPC since the mid-1960s, Museveni would later claim to have harbored a faint hope of changing the UPC from within. In January 1971, Idi Amin's forces overthrew Apollo Milton Obote while he was on a visit to Singapore to attend a Commonwealth conference. Idi Amin became the president of Uganda. Within 48 hours of Idi Amin's coup d'etat, Yoweri Museveni and 4 of his colleagues crossed into Tanzania intent on garnering support for a protracted liberation struggle against Amin. They made their way to Dar es Salaam, but unfortunately for Museveni, at this time he failed to gain Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere's support for any kind of liberation movement which did not entail the reinstatement of Apollo Milton Obote as the President of Uganda. Anyways, this setup did not deter Museveni. Through the 1970s, he was active in covertly recruiting sympathizers inside and outside of Uganda, organizing military training, mostly in Mozambique, and infiltrating arms into the country. He later took part in Milton Obote's abortive raid into Uganda in September of 1972, and in this and other clashes with Idi Amin's men, a number of his close friends were killed. Museveni started working as a lecturer in northern Tanzania in the town of Moshi, and it was while he was working there that he formed the opposition Front for National Salvation, FRONASA, in 1973. The formation of FRONASA as a guerrilla organization was a direct response not only to Idi Amin's seizure of power in 1971, but also to Museveni's disagreements over strategy with Milton Obote. Initially, Idi Amin's coup d'etat had united Museveni and Obote to oppose him through armed struggle. But within a few months, these two men split over whether this armed struggle should be fought as a guerrilla struggle or a conventional war, and whether soldiers should receive political education or just military training. Museveni's FRONASA originally consisted mostly of him and a small cohort who had gone to secondary school with him, plus others who had joined his political discussion group at university, and a few of the young ex-UPC leftists who had fled Uganda after Idi Amin's coup. Through his Frelimo contacts, Yoweri Museveni arranged for 30 recruits to go in two groups to Mozambique during 1971 and 1972 for political education and military training. Unfortunately, these newly trained comrades who constantly infiltrated Uganda met disaster at every turn. Consequently, Yoweri Museveni's FRONASA ceased to operate from March 1973 until 1976. But after Frelimo took power in Mozambique in 1975, Museveni sent another group of 28 recruits, including his own brother, for training. Yoweri also personally provided most of this group's political education. The surviving members of the three cohorts trained by Frelimo, particularly the last, filled many of the senior positions of what was to later become the NRA High Command during the Ugandan Bush War and after. The struggle to rule post-Amin Uganda began with the 1979 Tanzanian invasion that overthrew Idi Amin's military dictatorship. Two small and antagonistic Ugandan contingents, which were Museveni's FRONASA and Kikosi Maalum, which was loyal to Milton Obote, formed the Uganda National Liberation Army, the UNLA, and accompanied the much larger Tanzanian People's Defense Force into Uganda. After Idi Amin had been deposed, Yoweri Museveni served in the interim governments of Yusuf Lule and later Godfrey Binaisa as defense minister and later as a minister for regional cooperation. But according to various sources, Yoweri Museveni was unhappy with the political intrigue that dominated the landscape of Ugandan politics. Ultimately, Museveni supported the removal of both these interim presidents. With Milton Obote back in Uganda from May 1980, Yoweri Museveni hurriedly formed his own party, the Uganda Patriotic Movement, to oppose him. The public was skeptical of this new party because of its leaders' inexperience in government as well as their seemingly radical ideas. After the deeply flawed election of December 1980, which brought Obote back to power, most Ugandans believed that Milton Obote regained power illegitimately by manipulating the rules and then the results of the election. In addition, with one exception, all the candidates from Yoweri Museveni's party for the National Assembly, including him, lost their races in this election. Yoweri Museveni used this belief that the election results were dubious to frame the rebellion that he was about to start as being a popular struggle. And all of this would be the genesis of the war in Uganda. In terms of influence, the guerrilla organization that Yoweri Museveni formed, originally called the Popular Resistance Army, was extremely weak in comparison to the government forces, the UNLA, and deeply dependent on establishing new trustworthy civilian contacts. Museveni's PRA rebels had few resources and little direct public support when they began the war. In addition, since members of FRONASA had turned in the arms that they used against Idi Amin's army, the rebels had few weapons. The war was launched on 6 February 1981 with a PRA attack on Kabamba barracks to the west of Kampala. The attack on Kabamba was to enable the rebels to get more guns. Although the rebels were 41 in total, they only had 27 guns and a rocket-propelled grenade RPG that mysteriously disappeared before the attack. Of the 27 guns, sources say Julius Chihanda, who had been a junior officer in the Uganda National Liberation Army, brought 16 guns. The rebels who did not have guns were meant to carry the force's bounty after an attack. Yoweri Museveni says that they used to call these unarmed carrier rebels commandos to make them feel as important as the fighters. This is why, although there were 41 at the start of the war, the most renowned in the history of this Ugandan civil war are the historical 27 rebels as they came to be known. One of these rebels was Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda. Paul Kagame was born to a Tutsi family in southern Rwanda. When he was a toddler, the Rwandan Revolution ended centuries of Tutsi political dominance, and so his family fled to Uganda, where he spent the rest of his childhood as a refugee. Paul Kagame and another child of Rwandan refugees, Fred Ruggiema, fought for Museveni's Fronasa after the war that deposed Idi Amin. Because Milton Obote prevented Rwandan refugees from being integrated into the new Ugandan army, Yoweri Museveni took on Paul Kagame and Fred Ruggiema as bodyguards. So now when Museveni launched his rebellion, Kagame and Ruggiema joined his PRA primarily to ease conditions for Rwandan refugees that were now being persecuted by Milton Obote. As a result of Yoweri Museveni's inclusive approach and Obote's increased persecution, an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Banyarwanda, both Ugandan citizens of Rwandan descent as well as post-1959 Rwandan refugees, joined the PRA, which was later called the NRA. Back to the story at hand. Although the 27 rebels went ahead with the planned attack on Kabamba, their mission to break open the underground armory failed. The fighters managed to take a few guns and several vehicles before retreating. According to Yoweri Museveni, the rebels failed to access the armory because one of their own, Eli Tungwine, went against instructions and shot a soldier instead of wrestling him down. This alerted a Tanzanian guard near the armory. As for Milton Obote, from the start of his second regime, his UPC was much weaker than it had been before Idi Amin's coup d'etat. The UPC government faced new security threats throughout the country, resulting from the availability of weapons from Idi Amin's defeated soldiers. In addition, waves of looting over Amin's overthrow greatly weakened the economy inherited from Idi Amin. Consequently, Obote's UPC relied heavily on coercion, threats, seizure of property, arbitrary arrests, and torture of opponents to maintain its authority. In particular, it allowed its soldiers to wreak havoc on civilians during military operations. As a result of all of this, Obote's UPC was not popular amongst the masses. In the first phase of the war, which was from February to approximately August of 1981, Yoweri Museveni and a few lightly armed followers entered an area called the Luwero Triangle and started to create clandestine civilian supply networks. Meanwhile, Yusuf Lule, the former president, founded and became head of a rebel group called the Uganda Freedom Fighters, the UFF. On 8 June 1981, Lule's UFF merged with Museveni's PRA to form the National Resistance Movement and its military wing, the NRA. Yusuf Lule became the chairman of the NRM while Museveni became its vice chairman, as well as chairman of the High Command of the National Resistance Army, the group's armed wing. In the Luwero Triangle, the NRA carried out attacks against the police and the military, established training camps, and began to recruit from the local population. At the end of 1982, a massive counterinsurgency of the government army began, which attempted to destroy the guerrillas and break their support among the civilian population through massive violence and expulsion. The NRA was able to retreat to Singo in the north of the Luwero Triangle and survive the government offensive despite a serious food shortage. During this period of great difficulties, the NRA also recruited civilians, in particular youths who had fled from the government army and the marauding Youth Wingers, the youth organization of Obote's ruling UPC. Nevertheless, the NRA was still weak and poorly armed relative to the government forces. However, once the NRA had acquired some weapons, it reversed its dependence on civilians. Many of its leaders also became overly confident that they would soon win the war. In reaction to each loss, the UNLA increased the size of its offensives, attempting to encircle the NRA's safe zone and crush it. In their operations, UNLA troops attacked and looted villages, increasing the animosity between local inhabitants of Luwero and the government. During the fourth phase of the war, approximately from July 1983 to March of 1985, the NRA insisted that most civilians leave the war zone to allow it to concentrate its forces on fighting the UNLA. During this period, the NRA grew markedly stronger militarily as compared to the government forces. The NRA conducted successful military operations in both depopulated and populated areas in the Luwero Triangle. During these operations, the NRA seized large amounts of weapons and cash from government banks. In the last phase of the war, the NRA established a second front in the west and then created a large new safe zone that eventually included Uganda's western region. In addition, its military strength grew equal to that of the UNLA. As the war went on, trouble was brewing for Milton Obote and his government. Serious divisions broke out within the ranks of the Ugandan army because of the heavy casualties that the soldiers were suffering at the hands of the NRA. The Acholi soldiers in the army accused their Langi counterparts of doing nothing serious to fight the NRA. On top of that, the early appointment of one Brigadier Smith, a junior officer, to the position of Chief of Staff, replacing late Major General David Oyite Ojok, did not go down well with the Acholi officers. Subsequently, in early 1985, they mobilized their forces and camped in a place called Gulu. In early July 1985, these soldiers started their march to Kampala, briefly fighting off Langi soldiers at Karuma before deposing Milton Obote on the morning of July 27, 1985. Immediately, they named General Tito Okello as president of the military council. General Okello invited former soldiers of Idi Amin's army to re-enter Uganda from the Sudanese refugee camps and participate in the civil war on the government's side. These units fought well, but they were equally interested in looting and did not discriminate between supporters and enemies of the government. This reintroduction of Idi Amin's infamous cohorts didn't portray a good picture for General Okello's government, and it helped create a new tolerance of Yoweri Museveni. In November 1985, peace talks between the military junta and the NRA started in Nairobi. Negotiations dragged on, but with General Okello and the remnants of the UNLA army thoroughly discouraged, Yoweri Museveni had only to wait for the regime to disintegrate. An agreement was soon signed, but it became apparent that it was not going to work since fighting continued and abuse of human rights skyrocketed. In January 1986, welcomed enthusiastically by the local civilian population, Yoweri Museveni moved against Kampala. On 26 January 1986, General Tito Okello was overthrown by Yoweri Museveni and his NRA. Museveni formally claimed the presidency on 29 January 1986, and immense problems of reconstruction of Uganda awaited his new regime. It has been estimated that approximately 100,000 to about 500,000 people, including combatants and civilians, died across Uganda as a result of the Ugandan Bush War. General Tito Okello fled to the southern Sudan with the remnants of his army. He later returned home in 1993 under an amnesty granted by Yoweri Museveni. As for Paul Kagame and other Rwandan officers who fought in the war, after the NRA took power in 1986, their frustration with their unequal status in Ugandan society resurfaced. As Paul Kagame later stated, he was never able to rise to his full potential in the NRA because no one ever forgot that he was Rwandan. Partly as a result, Rwigema, Paul Kagame and others stepped up their plans to retake Rwanda. The Rwandan Alliance for National Unity, which had been founded in Nairobi in 1979 and was now able to gather in Kampala, Uganda, changed its name to the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, in December of 1987 and began plotting an invasion on Rwanda. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.